Good afternoon, Chairman and Secretary and members of the CERD Committee. My name is Lorraine Garcia, and I am of the Apache Indian Nation. We are a sovereign people, and I am of the first agricultural people of the clan of the Amoles and of the Copper people. And I am of a third clan, also called the Rincones, the people of the place that you go in, one way in and one way out. Many times, people have come up to me and said, when they find out that I'm Apache, oh, the Apache, they were a formidable force to be reckoned with. And as a young adult, I was not taken aback by that statement as I am today as a woman, with a better understanding of my people in the historical sense. I am a history keeper, which is different from a historian. I document the shared stories and the oral histories and the written documents of my people. In our shadow report, I wrote the Apache Genízaro and the 250-year enslavement, of which is shared in the chronology of my Indian people. That is not shared and is unrecorded history of slavery up until now. An excerpt of it is, slavery and land loss are the most damaging psychological and historical events the capable and its doctrine of discovery has left upon Apache people. One would assume that slavery for Apaches ended in 1829, and again in 1865. It would have to also be assumed that Apache slavery has been lost to time, since it is not written in the American history books or taught in the American educational systems, but that is not such the case. The Holy War still continues on Apache reservations in the southwestern United States, and also a large population of Apaches living in urban areas. Apache religion, culture, and spiritual beliefs are still under attack. The culture war is continuous, and we are stuck in a historical constant in the making. And Apaches today on reservations are still confined and are not to be rescued, and death for them is unimaginable. The Holy See's legacy in America for Apache Indian peoples is continuum, and stems from the doctrine of discovery that is a living and breathing document. And it is sucking the life out of Apache people. This doctrine of discovery is the tie that binds and bounds indigenous peoples in today's advanced systematic slavery of psychological and physical proportions. The indigenous peoples in the United States reservation systems were not expected to have lived this long. In my paper submitted in the Apache Indian Shadow Report, I also include 44 Apache devs in the mission churches, records of one single church. Those 44 devs are not even, it is inadequate to the actual deaths in a 250-year period, because it is only one church of numerous within Apache Indian territory that includes 6 U.S. American states and 3 states in Mexico. New Mexico in the U.S. is the original, the first seat of slavery in the United States, which was Mexico at the time in the late 1500s. In the paper, I wrote specifically of Apache people from a single region, the Gila region. And that is why there are the records from that single church. But in actuality, Apache peoples from all Apache regions were being sold into slavery. As a whole, Apache Indian peoples were enslaved from the late 1500s, putting the years of enslavement to well over 300 years. This is not in American history books. This is not acknowledged history, because as previously stated, the culture war is continuous and stuck in a historical constant in the making, so it cannot be contextualized. And in today's perspective, that means the United States would have to write and acknowledge and admit that the practice of genocide and ethnocide is still taking place. Today in the United States, which stands for justice and freedom for all. But no, because the justice and freedom they speak of is reserved for those people who immigrated to the United States and not for its indigenous peoples. When the Apache Indian lands were ceded to the United States, they were ceded under the guise of the Doctrine of Discovery, which was an inherent state of land and its dominions, and its indigenous people already were under the yoke of oppression, Apache land loss, Apache confinement, and for those Apaches not confined, a state of homelessness was a resolve that still exists today. The dire state of many southwestern Apache reservations are in a state of urgent redress and a state of emergency. In particular, the San Carlos Apache Reservation, diseases are rampant, with cancer a leading cause, wiping out whole clans and nearly whole districts. Cancer-causing agents like Agent Orange and dioxins are in the main river aquifers that are the main water sources for homes, hospitals, schools, and buildings in the San Carlos Reservation. The mining and nearby corporations on and off the reservations is another source of not only water contamination but also ground. The psychological damage of youths that come of age to the realization of confinement and containment of their everyday living conditions are the results of the high rate of suicides on San Carlos reservations and other indigenous United States reservation systems. Land loss are also continuous on the spiritual level on and off the reservation, for Apache and the Indian peoples have a spiritual connection to lands. Their sacredness of place, animal, and mineral are always threatened because Apache lands are held in trust by the U.S. government, and Apaches will never be the true landowners, but only trustees of the lands that were inherent to them. The homeless Apache are usually the direct descendants of Genízaro Apaches, those enslaved until 1829 and then relocated with Mexican established colonies in the southwest USA. Their ancestral Genízaro ancestors were the Apache and that could not be bartered back by their Apache families. So thousands and thousands of Apache slaves, their children, and the children and those children were born in servitude. Let us not romanticize the arranged marriages that took place. Absent were baptisms of those Apache women who were forced into arranged marriages to men of every background. Other slaves, Apaches in servitude, black slaves, some in the same households or different households. This form of marriage was another part of the in servitude and the economics of the day resulting from the slave trade. The dehumanizing of Apache women was one of moral corruption, and not to leave out the children. The selling of children for profit for labor was also moral turpitude. This was the beginnings of human trafficking for slave labor and sexual immorality, but that still exists today on a global wide level. On a subconscious level, the descendants of Apache women sold into slavery still feel the long-lasting ramifications in today's patrilineal and patronizing American society. Women today, especially indigenous women who stance in a historical sense were as landowners revered in high respectable statuses as teachers, childbearers, medicine women, agriculturalists, strive hard today to get back to a respectful status today of the above mentioned, and just a few in their whole lifetime will achieve this mere status. Apache women today strive to get back to that status in today's world that puts women in a second citizen status. In our shadow report, Elder Eddie Montoya's testimony, entitled The Testimony of Racial Discrimination, as an Apache Genízaro descendant, shares his childhood experiences of racial discrimination at a very young age of his parents and grandparents who were of Genízaro descent. And it should be noted that Apache Genízaros and Spanish and Mexican descendants of southwestern colonials still use that general term in a historical and contemporary sense, as it is a history that is being shared and written, and the racial idiom associated with it is still effectual in racial discriminatory fashion and indirect intention. Elder Eddie Montoya states in his testimonial, I want to disclose my hardships as an Apache. When my parents got married, they went to live in Cienega and lived in a cave. Cienega was a section of the Hadalosa. At some point, the Wilsons took over the Cienega. When I was about 3 years old, my grandparents and 8 other families had to move to their lands and out of their lands and jacals, and everything was taken away from them, even their dogs. So for many homeless Apache people to be uprooted from the traditional homelands went on for decades. And there are the continual historical displacement of Apache people who were not a part of the reservation systems, but of the homeless system and the landless system. While Elder Eddie Montoya's family was being shipped about in the mid-1920s, my own Apache grandfather on my father's side was given permission to leave the Mexican Indian ejido that many Apache's ancestors had been sold into slavery to work in Mexican various mines. There were many, like my grandfather, that came back to the U.S. only to come back to being landless, homeless, and essentially peopleless. Many Apache and it had been relocated out of the Southwest homelands out onto reservations or out-of-state reservations, or the whole clan and tribe had been sold into slavery, murdered, or just lost to them. Other Apache families, like my mother's family from New Mexico, were homeless, were part of the U.S. government federal agricultural program way before the federal programs of the 1930s with Roosevelt New Deal. They were put on trains and shipped out of various federal-ran agricultural camps, some to where they were originally indigenous and held there under the federal government rule. Just as Eddie Elder Montoya describes being racially discriminated by his peers growing up, so were Apache families put to work in the agricultural camps, and the result of these programs was relocation and displacement from Apache lands forever. Elder Eddie Montoya describes his fight against racial discrimination as one of the several Apache families that were able to remain in his ancestral lands after his descendancy of Apache enslavement of 250 years, and through the colonial era of established Genízaro Apache, which is a true and legitimate Apache descendancy. In his testimonial, he writes of his ongoing struggle in his ancestral lands today. There have been many battles from the mind of...
Perdón, le voy a pedirle si puede terminar, por favor, su intervención. If you can finish your intervention.
Oh, yes. The Holy See Statement to the CERD, pardon has its own demands, which are truth, justice, reparation, and conciliation, and which includes overcoming the weight of history by a correct rereading of each other's history in order to acquire better knowledge and acceptance of the other for a culture of peace. The Holy See Statement to the CERD correlates to our presence here today, a demand to seek the creation of a true commission, and with the Holy See, so truth and justice can become the outcome of the corrections and eventual rereading of each other's histories. Thank you, Chairman.
Muchas gracias, señora García. Tiene la palabra en este momento la señora Bowers, por favor.
Good morning, Chairperson. Good morning, members of the CERD Committee and attendees. My name is India Reed Bowers, and I am counsel for the Apache Nation. Since the last reporting of the Holy See to the CERD Committee, significant strides have been made in international law regarding the rights of indigenous peoples. However, despite this progress in international law and a continued global shift towards restoring equality therein, the Holy See's current core report to CERD contains no mention of indigenous peoples. Our shadow report in its entirety makes the case for, amongst other things, the need for a truth commission regarding the Holy See and the Intercaterra and the Apache and indigenous peoples, reparations, and changes in related and resulting laws and policies regarding indigenous territories and sovereignty therein, and a legally formal and public rescinding of by the Holy See of the Intercaterra and its legal, political, spiritual, and territorial legacies. Past and ongoing effects of the Holy See Intercaterra, including experienced crimes against humanity and genocide, cultural genocide, ethnocide, ecocide, and environmental racism, as experienced by the Apache and Ene, and that result from the legacy of the Intercartera must be addressed legally and formally with proper and indigenous FPIC free prior informed consent-based redress and remedy. Formal and direct legal codification by the Holy See must be made that directly denounces and rescinds all subsequent and related regional, national, and international legal decisions, treaties, and codifications based on and developed from the inherent racism against indigenous peoples by the Intercartera, such as direct linkages and references to the Intercartera and the doctrine of discovery as contained in United States law and policy. Moreover, full indigenous rights must be canonized in the Holy See law. Language such as that barbarous nations must be overthrown and brought to the faith itself of the Intercartera serve not only as instruction and endorsement of the brutal subjugation of indigenous peoples, but continues to deeply and directly influence politics and policies today, including identity, determination, and judicial processes and decisions therein. Due to the history of colonialism for wealth and domination in the context of land expansion as directed, endorsed, and permitted by the Holy See to kingdoms and thus and subsequently states, the Apache and the Ene do not sit as equals, technically, even at the UN today, negotiating, voting, debating, contributing, and more, as the Holy See and member states enjoy. Such a situation is, in and of itself, discrimination against the Apache and the Ene as political and legal and territorial sovereigns. It cannot be overlooked that the Apache and the Ene are here today reporting peacefully and socio-structural technically in accordance with the current dominant world legal political UN system itself as civil society. The legacy of the Intercartera and its related palpables and doctrines persists today, as does the related suffering, not least being in the form of the notion-turned law of indigenous minds, bodies, lands, and political and identity statuses as terra nullius, as grounds for conversion into the ways of the dominant, i.e. to, quote, instruct the aforesaid indigenous inhabitants and residents and train them from the Intercartera. Such discrimination not only led to slavery, land grabbing, enforced dependencies and torture, but also Indian boarding schools and abuse therein, forced relocations and management of indigenous peoples, converting peoples out of their own legal, political, spiritual, and land-based cultural traditions, independence, and sovereignty. As a result of such discriminatory language and concepts, non-remedied continuation of the legacy of the Intercartera and its related bulls and doctrines in turn deeply violates human and indigenous rights of the Apache and Ene and indigenous peoples, including but not limited to the right to self-determination in its fullest forms, and the context of state federal controlled identification processes, state borders dividing indigenous peoples, tribes, and nations with state law, legal political discrimination by states against indigenous leadership that is traditional and religious, and concepts of who and who does not have, in accordance with currently codified international law, territorial integrity per nations or people, resulting in divisions and losses further of territorial and cultural integrities and full and equal participation, including the participation in the defining of authority, peace, aggression, international criminal law, codification, negotiation, and membership. Sad to note and related is not only that there is no mention of indigenous throughout the core report of the Holy See to the committee, but that the only remotely related mention of pre- or non-colonial peoples, tribes, or societies is a reference to the neo-colonial political concept of tribalism, a current status quo negative, discriminatory stereotype that spins tribes as, in essence, uncivilized, as described in the Intercartera, as barbarous, in contrast to being converted to and or assimilated into church kingdom statism in the context of political and or territorial self-determination. Such use of racially discriminatory terminology propagates colonial internal or external subjugation and discrimination against traditional indigenous leadership and politics as tribes with own cultures and traditions, laws, and governance, something that the Holy See claims for itself. The Holy See's Intercaterra not only blessed policies and practices of colonialism that caused what is expressed by indigenous peoples themselves as genocide, but it also put policies and practices into action through its missionaries and missions, churches, subsequent schools that continued to operate in alliance with kingdoms and subsequently states for own mutually collective world dominance and at the cost of indigenous peoples and their lands, lives, self-determination, sovereignty, independence, and cultures. Indigenous worldview has been systematically displaced and replaced by Catholic proselytizing and related and allied historical aggression and colonialism, including in the context of the establishment of UNESCO World Heritage Sites without the consent of indigenous peoples, with members and officials of the Catholic Church, such as the case of the San Antonio Missions World Heritage Site. Problematic is that the Holy See's report claimed moral authority in the sphere of international relations, which is also an act of non-diplomacy given the atrocities at hand, and creates a situation of perpetuation of discrimination. To deny and address women's situations of discrimination, intersectionality, and agreements therein with CERD further compounds discrimination against indigenous women and matriarchal, matrilineal, religious, familial, sociocultural traditions therein, the Apache Alliance. Such disregard and assumed authority on the part of the Holy See enables and even directly promotes violence against women, and specifically indigenous, matriarchal, and matrilineal women, peoples, nations, and societies. Amongst the Holy See's many continued international jurisdiction claims includes the recent canonizing of Junipero Serra on indigenous lands in the United States, California, against indigenous will, rights to self-determination, redress, truth in history, ethic, and peace and justice. In its current submission to the CERD, yet the Holy See continues with its context of moral mission. One only needs to observe the protection of state rights embedded in within the UN DRIP itself, the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Article 46.1, protecting the territorial integrity and political unity of sovereign independent states, coupled with knowledge regarding the active blocking of indigenous peoples, tribes, and nations access to UN decolonization process, along with and in contrast to indigenous declarations of sovereignty, autonomy, and independence overlooked, to see the continued legacy of racial discrimination and domination of the Intercaterra. By engaging in, either directly or through negligence regarding the actions of own congregations and leadership, discriminatory historical legacies remaining today, the Holy See is creating, promoting, and sponsoring, defending, supporting racial discrimination through lack of respect to rights of self-determination, indigenous peoples concerned and affected. The Holy See is promoting, both through direct action and inaction, that public authorities and public institutions can discriminate and override indigenous peoples, including in their own territories, and history accounting. To not undergo a process of redress, reparations, and full accountability regarding the Apache Alliance and the era of the Holy See, Catholic Church, and Intercaterra manifested atrocities and colonial jurisdiction and control that has resulted, including ongoing experienced ethnocide and cultural genocide, promotes and incites racial discrimination through exemplifying the very notion that indigenous peoples, as indigenous peoples, tribes, and nations, do not require, want, or need such formal remedy.
Puede concluir. You can finish your intervention. If you have some recommendation, you can
Then I just defer to our submitted recommendations and questions that we've given to the committee at the front of it.
Sí, muchas gracias a la intérprete. Tiene la palabra el señor por Michael Hill, por favor. Por favor, 10 minutos, por favor.
Babylon the Great, the prostitute on the beast.
Microphone.
Babylon the Great, the prostitute on the beast. One of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the punishment of the great prostitute, who sits by many waters. With her the kings of the earth committed adultery, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries." Then the angel carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness. There I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet-colored beast that was covered with blasphemous names, 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was dressed in purple and scarlet, and was glittering with gold, precious stones, and pearls. She had in her hand a golden cup filled with abominations and the filth of her adulteries. The name written on her forehead was a mystery: Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and abominations of the earth. I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of God's holy people, the blood of those who bore the testimony of Jesus Christ. When I saw her, I was greatly astonished. Then the angel said to me, "Why are you astonished? I will explain to you the mystery of the woman and of the beast she rides, which has the 7 heads and 10 horns. The beast, which you saw once was, now is not, and yet will come up out of the abyss and go into destruction. The inhabitants of the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the creation of the world, will be astonished when they see the beast, because it once was, now is not, and yet will come. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. They are also 7 kingdoms. 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other is yet to come. But when he does come, he will remain for only a short period of time. The beast who once was and now is not, and yet is of the 8th. He belongs to the 7 and is going into his destruction. The 10 horns you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received the kingdom, but for 1 hour will receive authority as kings along with the beast. They have one purpose and will give their power and authority to the beast. They will wage war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will triumph over them because he is the Lord of lords and King of kings. With him will be called chosen and faithful followers. Then the angel said to me, "The waters you saw where the prostitute sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, tongues. The beast and the 10 horns you saw will hate the prostitute. They will bring her to ruin and leave her naked. They will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. For God has put into their hearts to accomplish his purpose by agreeing to hand over to the beast their royal authority until God's words are fulfilled. The woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings and the nations of the earth. My name is Michael Paul Hill. I am a descendant of the Cheyenne, Cherokee, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Comanche, white Irish, and black descendancy, all in one person. I am a human being. I come on behalf of my nation to speak to you all in peace and in love, as a man just like you, and a woman just like you, all in all. Never in indigenous history or worldview do Aboriginal peoples evoke self-empowered authorities, but rather those of Begawanan, or creator of the universe. Indigenous peoples hold reverence for the sacred and holy that are called the Almighty or Creator through balance, harmony, love, and above all, equality of all living, plant, stone, animal, and human being. From the beginning of time, Indian peoples have practiced what these Begawanan God-fearing peoples, known as Christian conformists and colonizers, have understood. Since these colonial powers that stem from the Holy See's doctrine of discovery justify their own powers and sovereignty as they've been granted to them by God, then indigenous peoples, whose lineage is traced back to the Creator, should be given the same equal powers inherent to the peoples to govern their own and without being molested by colonial regimes. But where in the discourse of the 21st century should concepts apply according to anti-colonialism, according to self-determination, according to peace, according to justice, truth and harmony and redress, and most importantly, reparations? The Church, the Holy See, the Vatican used the Jesuits in the late 1700s to steal our gold, our minerals, the blood of the people who were the actual saints, to justify their dominions over all things, including, as quote, the moral authorities of the universe. God is the moral authority of the universe. He alone is the one who stands before all things. And we, as his children, cannot give our power to men who have molested, raped, pedophiled the children and the daughters and the babies of the Almighty and the earth. It is important to note that we know that the reason behind the use of Begawanan and their own sovereignty and colonial mechanisms has its beginnings as what is termed and known as corporation soul, in which the Roman Catholic Church and its imperialistic kingdoms of the earth, such as the Queen of England, use the same mechanisms to gain control and power over peoples and their territories because of their own superiority and racism that they carry within their minds, their bodies, their institutions, and most importantly, inside their spirit, inside their mankind's hearts. For these reasons stated, there was no possible way for the peoples to engage in a system that is adversely affecting the indigenous people's right to self-determination, autonomy, freedom, and populations without the free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous peoples whose territories were colonized through conquest and invasion by European derelict religious groups rejected by their own nations, governments, and peoples. In reality, the rejected masses assumed plenary power over the Aboriginal people's lands, territories, and natural resources within their own personal reservations. They consulted not with the peoples whose lands they stole, raped, and tore up, and killed, and murdered in the spirit of the hearts of the men whom they assumed power over. Even today, the title and deeds to the lands of the original and true owners of the lands have never been returned. And the title and deed of our homelands is written in the stone, in the air, in the rock, in the water, in every place of the land. The Holy See has, in past sessions, has stated to the CERD Committee that they have abrogated the Papal Bulls Indicatera of 1493. Yet they have to publish such rescinding or put it in such direct changes into a worldwide and nation-state-wide print. We, the Inde, want the evidence produced worldwide and not just abrogated in the words of the CERD Committee. The Holy See is going to accept accountability and culpability to all wrongs to set the stage to renounce the colonial nations that rule and have established laws under the guise of the doctrine of discovery. The Holy See will face its chaos it created and humanize the indigenous peoples and their communities that have been dehumanized to set them free in their inherited lands. In judgment, we do stand against you, Holy See, by yesteryear's, today's, and tomorrow's ethical, moral, spiritual, cultural, and all legal principles today. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, señor